Sergeant Mason Rourke had trained for every kind of situation: ambushes, zero-gravity combat, deep space recon, but nothing prepared him for waking up inside an alien cell. His last memory was the screech of metal and flashing lights aboard. The scout vessel Sentinel, spiraling near Europa after an unexpected attack. Now, the stale air was thick with a strange metallic scent, and cold energy bars pulsed quietly along the walls, casting an eerie blue glow on everything they touched. The cell was small but advanced, clearly designed not just to imprison but to break spirit. Rourke didn't panic. He didn't shout or slam his fists like some of the other prisoners had. Instead, he lay still, blinking slowly as he studied every corner of his cage, every sound beyond the walls. Instinct told him he was being watched, and he wouldn't give his captors the satisfaction of seeing fear. The creatures responsible, Tarsari, he would later learn, were tall and insect-like, with sleek armored bodies that clacked as they walked and pitch-black eyes that never blinked. They moved with methodical cruelty, never speaking, only obeying some silent chain of command. Rourke noticed how they never came too close to the prisoners, even with all their technology. Maybe they thought themselves superior. Maybe they were just careful. That would be smart. But Rourke had seen smarter enemies fall. He knew their type, conquerors who treated living beings like tools, not lives. They had no idea what kind of mind they'd just locked in their floating cage. The prison was called the Maw, a name he overheard in the quiet murmurs of other inmates, spoken in dozens of different alien tongues. Orbiting a dying red star, at the edge of the known systems, the Maw was a fortress designed to keep prisoners in and hope out. It wasn't just a holding facility, it was a monument to despair. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. Long corridors with looping patrols, no windows, constant artificial light, and a system that made escape seem pointless. But Rourke didn't need hope to act. He needed patterns, and patterns were everywhere. Each day followed a precise schedule. Wake-up alarms blared at the same time. Food came in the same trays, carried by the same guards. Patrol routes rarely changed. Every part of the routine was designed to keep things under control. But the same routine gave Rourke something to work with. He wasn't the strongest in the prison, but strength wasn't his weapon, his mind was. He started walking the yard, pretending to stretch. But in truth, he counted steps, learned door codes from guard movements, tracked response times to prisoner disturbances. He began identifying which guards were confident, which ones were careless, and which ones might be afraid. He also observed the other prisoners, some broken, some quiet, a few dangerous. Different species, different languages, all beaten down by the same invisible force. But every now and then, he saw flashes of what they used to be: leaders, fighters, survivors. He made mental notes. Some might be useful later, if it ever came to that. He didn't speak to anyone yet. Not until he knew who he could trust. Not until he knew who he could lead. Mason Rourke didn't know how long he'd been in the Maw before. His name came up on the labor rotation. He was led down cold halls past cells, through security checkpoints, and into a cavernous workyard where the real heartbeat of the prison thudded in silence. Machinery rumbled. Inmates slaved under watchful eyes. And yet, in the middle of it all, Rourke smiled for the first time since capture, not out of joy, but recognition. This wasn't just a prison. It was a machine. And machines, no matter how well built, always had weak spots. The Tarsari thought they'd caged a soldier. They didn't realize they'd brought a strategist into their heart. And that was their first mistake. Mason Rourke knew that escape wasn't about rushing blindly into danger. It was about watching, waiting, and understanding the cage before trying to break it. Every day in the Maw gave him a clearer picture of how the prison worked, and more importantly, how it didn't. At first, he kept his distance from the others, listening more than speaking, learning their languages not with words, but through body language, habits, and quiet moments of shared suffering. Slowly, he began to recognize familiar traits among the inmates: strength hidden behind silence, intelligence disguised as madness, and pain buried beneath cold eyes. The Tarsari thought they'd broken everyone, but Rourke saw cracks in that illusion. The prison was full of warriors pretending to be weak. He started small, helping an old alien with a limp during work detail, fixing a broken tool without being asked, offering a portion of his own ration to a sickly inmate who hadn't eaten in days. He never asked for anything in return, and that alone began to draw attention. No one had seen kindness in a long time, especially not from a human. One by one, they started talking to him, briefly at first, then with more trust. There was Kale, a former war pilot from a bird-like species with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. There was Urin, a brute with scales and strength but the soul of a poet. And then there was Risha, a quiet thinker from a water world whose voice was barely above a whisper, but whose ideas were sharp enough to cut steel. Together, they formed an invisible bond, never too obvious, never gathered in the same place too often, but always connected by shared glances and quiet nods. Rourke taught them how to watch the guards like he did, how to time the patrols, how to read body language, how to see the details others missed. He noticed one guard who limped slightly, likely from an old injury, and used it to track his route more precisely. He learned that food deliveries were always late after maintenance checks, and that the scanners near the mess hall glitched if approached at just the right angle. The more he studied, the more he realized that the Maw, despite its fearsome reputation, was not perfect. It relied too much on fear, too much on routine. The Tarsari were clever, but they didn't expect creativity from prisoners. That was their weakness. They had built a cage of steel, lights, and cameras, but not one of hope. And that's where Rourke had the advantage. Hope wasn't given. It was built quietly, carefully, like a fire fed one spark at a time. Every corner of the prison started to look different to him. What once were walls became cover. What looked like trash became tools. Even the ventilation system, ignored by the guards, became a map in his mind. He began to notice how the control room rotated shifts at exact intervals, leaving brief windows where the feed was monitored by fewer eyes. He paid attention to the rhythm of machines in the work zone, to the timing of the security drones. Nothing was random, and that meant everything could be planned. He didn't share all his findings yet, not until he was sure. But the idea of escape, once a distant dream, now felt closer with every passing day. It wasn't just about freedom. It was about proving that the Tarsari were wrong. That even stripped of armor and weapons, a human could still fight. And not just fight, lead. Rourke kept his focus sharp. He never allowed himself to look too hopeful, never smiled too long. This was still a dangerous place. One wrong move, one loose word, and the guards would crack down with force. But as he walked those same gray halls, under the same flickering lights, he no longer saw a prison. He saw a battlefield waiting to be shaped, a trap waiting to be turned inside out. The cage was real, yes, but it was built by creatures who didn't understand what humans could become when cornered. And if the Tarsari had underestimated that, then their time was running out. Mason Rourke knew that sometimes the first step toward freedom was to bleed. Not just for the sake of pain, but to send a message, one the guards couldn't ignore and the prisoners couldn't forget. So he chose his moment carefully. He waited until the lunch hour, when the maximum number of eyes were watching, and then picked the biggest Tarsari enforcer on duty. The creature towered over him, armored and armed, but Rourke didn't hesitate. He lunged, not to win, but to provoke. A solid hit to the enforcer's side caused barely a flinch, but it was enough. The Tarsari responded with predictable force, slamming Rourke into the wall, activating the shock rods and dragging him to solitary confinement with brutal efficiency. But he'd gotten what he wanted. He'd timed how long it took the guards to arrive. He'd confirmed how quickly reinforcements came. And he'd shown every prisoner in the mess hall that a human, just one, was willing to stand up to the ones who ruled them. Word spread fast, faster than Rourke expected. When he returned 3 days later, bruised but unbroken, something had shifted. Prisoners who once stared at the floor now met his eyes. Silent nods greeted him in the halls. A few whispered words, passed between cell blocks. The human fought back. That was the moment the spark caught flame. Rourke didn't waste time. He began reaching out, first to those he'd already quietly connected with, Kale, Risha, Urine, and then to others. He knew the prison was divided not just by walls, but by distrust. Different species had old grudges. Fights had broken out before, fueled by hunger, fear, or the Tarsari's manipulations. But Rourke wasn't here to play into their hands. He started building something different. He encouraged the strong to protect the weak. He made rivals work, together under the same task. And always, he stayed at the center, calm and patient, never forcing, just guiding. His message was simple. They all wanted the same thing. And alone, none of them would get it. But together, they could tear this place apart. It wasn't easy. Some aliens mocked the idea, calling him foolish or naive. But when he confronted them, it wasn't with anger, it was with logic. He pointed out how many years they'd all spent under the same boot, how nothing ever changed. He spoke not just as a leader, but as a fellow prisoner. And slowly, they started to listen. There was a shift in the air, quiet but real. In the work zones, whispers turned to planning. In the mess hall, rival groups began sharing space without fighting. The Tarsari noticed the changes but didn't understand them. Their scanners and patrols couldn't detect unity. They didn't realize what Rourke was doing because they never imagined it possible. In their culture, rebellion meant chaos. But what Rourke was building wasn't chaos. It was order with purpose. Every rebellion starts with belief, and belief was spreading, like fire through dry grass. Rourke began training others in small ways. How to move quietly, how to signal without speaking, how to hide tools in plain sight. He created a system of silent communication using hand signs and floor markings. Escape wasn't the plan yet. It was too early. But resistance? That was already alive. And Rourke never let them forget one important thing. The Tarsari ruled because they divided. They encouraged fear, isolation, and silence. But now, that silence was broken. The prisoners spoke, worked, and watched as one. And that, more than any weapon, was dangerous. The Tarsari had failed to translate a simple Earth phrase, divide and conquer. They lived by it, used it to control. But Rourke had flipped it. He wasn't here to divide. He was here to unite. And as the tension in the prison grew heavier by the day, one truth became clear to everyone inside those walls. Something was coming. Not just a riot, not just escape. A war born from the courage of a single soldier who refused to stay quiet. The fire had been lit, and now nothing could stop it from spreading. The night was silent, colder than usual, and in the maw, silence always meant something was about to happen. For most prisoners, it was just another stretch of endless darkness, under the artificial lights. But for Mason Rourke and the small group that had grown around him, this night was different. It was the night everything would begin. After weeks of careful planning, watching guard rotations, stealing scraps of tech, and passing coded messages, they were ready to strike. Not a full uprising, but a test. A spark to see if the fire they'd built was strong enough to burn. Rourke had chosen a section of the maintenance wing, a forgotten part of the prison rarely monitored, filled with broken machinery and old access terminals. With Risha's quiet brilliance, they had hacked one of those terminals days ago. mapping out emergency door overrides and backdoor systems the Tarsari no longer paid attention to. With makeshift weapons hidden in tool bins and sharpened scraps disguised as cleaning tools, the rebels moved. Each step was measured, each breath held tight. The attack lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. A patrol of 2 Tarsari enforcers entered the hallway, just like every other night. But this time, they were being watched. The first fell, without a sound, taken from behind with a metal pipe to the head. The second managed to fire a single warning shot before Kale brought him down with a stolen shock rod. The sound echoed through the corridors, but the door was already sealed. For the first time in years, a Tarsari bled. The moment was burned into every eye that saw it, every prisoner who heard the sound. It was no longer a prison. It had become something else. When the guards realized what had happened, it was too late. The maintenance wing was cut off, the systems rerouted just long enough to keep them out. Inside, Rourke and his team worked fast, stripping the bodies of weapons and armor, removing parts from security panels and spreading the message through hidden channels. We took it. We hold it. Panic spread through the prison like a virus, not among the inmates, but among the guards. For years, they had relied on fear to keep order, believing that the prisoners would never act together. Now that illusion was broken. Cells buzzed with whispered conversations. Groups that once sat apart in the mess hall now exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. The rebellion wasn't a theory anymore. It was real. And Rourke's name began to travel faster than the guards could suppress it. Some called him a leader, others a fool with nothing left to lose. But all of them knew one thing. He had done something no one else dared to do. He had fought back, and won. The Tarsari response came swift and brutal. Reinforcements stormed the wing, armed with riot gear and sonic blasters. But Rourke had planned for that too. They didn't try to hold the ground. They had never meant to. The team split and scattered through hidden passages and maintenance tunnels, melting back into the general population before the guards could trap them. By the time control was reestablished, the damage was done. One of their own was dead, their systems had been hacked, and their prisoners were no longer afraid. From that night forward, the balance of power inside the maw had shifted. Rourke returned to his cell with bruises, a broken rib, and a quiet grin. He didn't need cheers or thanks. He just needed proof. And now he had it. The cage wasn't unbreakable. The guards weren't untouchable. The prison wasn't in control anymore. It was cracking, slowly, quietly, but surely. He had lit the match. The fire had caught. And soon, the whole structure would feel the heat. After the first strike, the Tarsari responded with a fury. The maw hadn't seen in decades. Sirens screamed day and night, patrols doubled, and food rations were cut in half. Prisoners were dragged from their cells, interrogated under harsh lights, and returned bruised and silent. Security drones buzzed like angry hornets in every corridor, scanning faces and scanning again. But fear had lost its grip, and the tighter the Tarsari squeezed, the more the rebellion slipped through their fingers. Mason Rourke had expected the crackdown, even counted on it. He knew brute force would be the only answer the Tarsari understood, and that gave him the upper hand. They would keep using the same tactics, the same routes, the same systems of control, while he and his growing network adapted. He wasn't just fighting a war now. He was building one from the ground up. He turned the prison itself into a weapon. Air vents became passageways for silent movement. Laundry chutes were repurposed to move tools and messages. Broken panels served as hiding spots for makeshift weapons fashioned from scrap and stolen parts. His people weren't soldiers. They were miners, smugglers, pilots, and thinkers. But he taught them to fight like a unit. One team would set traps using old wiring and pressure plates. Another would stage distractions that pulled guards away from key corridors. No area was ever truly safe again for the Tarsari. Each time they thought they had crushed the rebellion, it slipped away and reappeared somewhere new. Sabotaged power cores, damaged surveillance feeds, sudden blackouts. Rourke's tactics weren't about fighting head-on, but hitting where it hurt most. Control, order, routine. The Tarsari's greatest strength was their discipline, their cold precision, but Rourke used chaos like a scalpel. He knew when to strike and when to vanish. He created fear not through brutality, but through unpredictability. A silent hallway could become a trap. A prisoner sweeping the floor could be a scout. Even the walls seemed to whisper defiance. Each loss on their side only sharpened the resolve of his people. Even when a rebel cell was discovered and punished, others would rise to take their place. Rourke made sure of that. He didn't just lead, he inspired. He never asked anyone to take a risk he wouldn't take himself, and every cut he took became a symbol of the price they were all willing to pay for freedom. The Tarsari tried to silence the movement with isolation, breaking up known groups, but the network had grown too complex. Information was passed through a look, a gesture, a sequence of knocks. Rourke had built a rebellion that no cell wall could contain. And the strange part, to those watching him closely, was that he never looked like he was angry. Focused, yes. Determined, always. But not cruel. He never allowed the rebellion to turn into senseless violence. "This isn't revenge," he'd said once to Kale. "It's a mission. If we lose ourselves, then we've already lost." It was that clarity that kept the rebellion from crumbling when things got hard. And things did get hard. Supply lines were cut. Friends were lost. Trust was tested. But still they pushed on because now they believed, not just in the cause, but in each other. And through it all, the Maw changed. The cold, lifeless structure started to feel different. It wasn't just steel and sensors anymore. It echoed, with whispers of hope, flickers of courage, and the steady, quiet beat of a rebellion that would not die. Rourke, the soldier without a uniform, had become something more. He wasn't the only leader, but he was the symbol. A man who had walked into the heart of the enemy and turned fear into fire. The Tarsari may have built the prison, but Rourke had claimed the battlefield, and every corridor now carried the weight of that truth. The Maw had never felt more alive, but now it was dying. Slowly at first, then all at once. The constant strain of sabotage, power outages, and relentless guerrilla tactics had begun to take its toll. The prison systems, once carefully designed to maintain order and control, were failing. Lights flickered and dimmed. The air filtration system sputtered and groaned. For the first time in years, there was genuine panic in the eyes of the Tarsari guards. They scrambled to repair the damage, but they were too late. The rebellion had already taken root too deep. Mason Rourke knew that the final push was coming. It had to. He'd been preparing for it, organizing it, calculating every move like a chess master. The control tower, the heart of the prison, was their target. Taking it down would cripple the Tarsari, sever their grip on the Maw, and, most importantly, give the prisoners the chance to escape. Rourke knew this mission was a one-way trip. The Maw's security was too tight, the Tarsari too numerous, and the odds too stacked against him. But for the first time, he didn't care about survival. The thought of freedom for everyone else, the hope he had built, was enough. In the depths of the crumbling prison, Rourke and his closest allies began their assault. It was a multi-pronged attack, each part timed to precision. Kale led a distraction on one side of the facility, hacking into a maintenance panel to cause a chain reaction of system failures. On the other side, Urin and Risha planted explosives to weaken the structural integrity of the prison. Each team moved like ghosts, leaving only chaos in their wake. And through it all, Rourke guided them with his steady hand, orchestrating the final moves of this deadly dance. As the prison's lights dimmed further, the corridors became war zones, filled with flashes of fire and smoke. The Tarsari were scrambling, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The rebellion had taken on a life of its own, a wave of fury and defiance that could not be stopped. Rourke fought his way to the heart of the maw, through flooded hallways, over shattered glass and past guards who couldn't anticipate his next move. He fought not just with his fists, but with his mind. Every step was calculated. Every corner was checked. He knew the risks. He was ready for them. He reached the control tower just as the last of the defenses fell. The Tarsari guards, few in number now, rushed to meet him, but it was clear they were outmatched. The prison was falling apart, and the guards could no longer hold the line. A brutal fight broke out, echoing down the steel corridors. Rourke pushed forward, every blow, every move fueled by a single thought. This was it. He reached the command node, his breath ragged, his body bruised and broken. But he didn't stop. He knew the control systems for the entire maw were here, and if he could just hit the right sequence of buttons, the Tarsari would lose their ability to control anything. With shaky fingers, Rourke input the last command, a signal to Earth. He didn't need to explain. The message was simple, direct, and final. The maw is falling. The moment he transmitted it, the power in the prison flickered once more, and then went dark. The control systems went offline, and the lights died for good. Rourke, standing in the heart of a crumbling empire, took a breath. The mission was over. The battle for the maw had been won. The prison was lost. As the walls around him began to shake, he knew the inmates had risen, and there was no turning back now. The last thing Rourke saw before everything went black was the flicker of a distant star, a glimmer of light in the endless void of space. It was the only thing left untouched by the chaos, and it would be the beacon for those who would rise after him. Weeks passed before anyone came. In the silent aftermath of the rebellion, the maw drifted in space, a hollow shell of its former self. Its once mighty halls now stood empty, choked with smoke and dust. The air was thick with the stench of burned circuits and scattered debris. The Tarsari had been defeated, their control shattered beyond repair. The only sounds now were the faint hum of emergency lights and the scattered whispers of survivors. The prison was dead, but something new, something far more dangerous to their former captors, had begun to take root: hope. Survivors crawled from the wreckage, prisoners from every corner of the galaxy, liberated from their cells. They had watched the chaos unfold and, in the end, had stood in the ashes of the empire that had held them captive for so long. But what they spoke of, what they remembered most, was not the destruction, not the weapons, not the blood spilled. They spoke of one name: Mason Rourke. The stories were told in hushed tones, awe-lacing every word. They spoke of a human soldier, one who had taken on the might of the Tarsari with nothing but his wits, his strength, and his unshakable will. "He led us," said one of the survivors. "He didn't just fight for himself, he fought for everyone. He made us believe that we could win." "He was like a fire," another survivor added. "He burned everything in his path, and we followed him." Even the alien races that had once been enemies, some who had spent their entire lives under Tarsari rule, now spoke of him. To them, Rourke was no longer just a soldier. He was a symbol of something far more profound. He was the spark that ignited the fire of rebellion. He had shown them that a single individual, no matter how outmatched, could challenge the greatest of empires. He had shown them that humanity didn't just survive. It fought. And it won. As weeks turned into months, the news of the fall of the maw spread across the stars. Rourke's name became a legend, a whispered promise among the oppressed. The Tarsari could control the galaxies, but they couldn't control what Rourke had started. No one knew where he was, or even if he was still alive. Some believed he had perished in the final assault, his last message a final echo from a soldier who had given everything for freedom. Others, though, refused to believe it. The stories of his survival were wild but persistent. There were rumors that Rourke had made it off the maw before it collapsed, that he had found refuge among the stars, waiting for the right moment to strike again. No one could say for sure. But one thing was certain: he had left behind a legacy. When the human fleet finally arrived at the ruined maw, drawn by the signal Rourke had sent out, they found the prison in ruins, but they also found something far more valuable: survivors and the stories they told. The fleet's commanders listened as each alien race, one by one, described the human soldier who had led them. They spoke of him with reverence, as though he were a myth come to life. They spoke of how one human had become the rallying cry for so many. The reports were filed, the data sent back, but the stories would not be forgotten. To the human fleet, Rourke was a hero. To the Tarsari, he was a nightmare. To the prisoners he had freed, he was a god. The stars themselves would remember the day when the prison of the maw fell, not because of an overwhelming force of numbers or power, but because a single man had dared to defy an empire. And, in the end, that was enough. It was enough to start a movement, to light a fire that no one could put out. The universe had learned one undeniable truth: humanity didn't just survive. It fought. And it won.